6:15 in the morning, Wednesday, July 19th, 1972. Mirbat, the southern coast of Oman. The monsoon, the khareef, has been on the Dhofar plateau for 3 weeks. The cloud is at 400 feet, the visibility is below 1,000 meters, and the rain has been intermittent since midnight. The SAS forward base in the town is a single-storey mud and stone building, the Batt House, named for the British Army training team that officially does not exist in this country, manned by 9 men. The senior man is Captain Mike Kealy of B Squadron, 23 years old. The next senior is a Fijian sergeant named Talaiasi Labalaba, 30 years old, born in Vatutu Village in Nawaka on the island of Nadi, a veteran of active operations in Borneo and Aden, known to everyone in the regiment as Laba. The other 7 are corporals and troopers. None of them is wearing a uniform that identifies them as British military. None of them is supposed to be in the country. The war they were fighting had been running for 7 years before that morning. It had no official name. The British government had not acknowledged it publicly, wouldn't acknowledge it publicly, and actively discouraged anyone from asking about it. The soldiers who fought it wore no rank insignia and carried no documentation that identified them as serving British military personnel. The origins trace to 1962, when Muslim bin Nawfal founded what would become the Dhofar Liberation Front in the southern province of Oman, initially with Saudi and Iraqi backing, the organization nationalist rather than ideological in character. The first documented armed action came on June 9, 1965, an ambush on an oil company truck. The rebels dated their revolution from that date. What transformed the Dhofar insurgency from a local nationalist grievance into a serious Cold War problem was a congress held at Hamrin in September 1968. There, the organization renamed itself the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, the PFLOAG, adopted explicitly Marxist-Leninist ideology, extended its territorial ambitions across the Gulf, and formalized its relationships with a new set of external sponsors. Soviet weapons moved through the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, South Yemen, which served as the logistics hub and safe haven for the insurgency's external infrastructure. Young PFLOAG fighters trained in China, the Soviet Union, and Iraq. The organization's own leadership described their stance as Marxist-Leninist. By 1970, insurgents, known colloquially as the Adu, Arabic for the enemy, dominated the Dhofar plateau, operating freely across the high ground and mortaring the RAF airfield at Salalah within range. These weren't untrained tribesmen with aged rifles. By 1972, the Adu were equipped with Soviet and Chinese pattern weapons throughout. AK-47 assault rifles, SKS carbines, DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine guns, 82mm mortars, RPG rockets and recoilless rifles. Their webbing was Chinese pattern, muffled with cloth for noise discipline on the approach march. Their ammunition was plentiful, their communications organized, their tactical doctrine developed through years of sustained operations against the Sultan's forces. They had trained artillery crews embedded in their assault formation at Mirbat, men who knew how to operate a 25-pounder field gun, placed there because the plan included capturing the gun and turning it on the garrison. When they planned the assault on Mirbat, they planned it with the care of a force that expected to win. The political circumstances that made all of this possible on the British side start with the man who had been ruling Oman since 1932, Sultan Saeed bin Taimur. His prohibitions were extensive and documented. Electricity, bicycles, radios, trousers, sunglasses, Western dress, music, photography, dancing, newspapers, cigarettes. Oman, under Said bin Taimur, was a country operating at something close to a medieval level of infrastructure and political engagement. It wasn't a country that could fight and win a Marxist insurgency. On July 23, 1970, his son Qaboos, 29 years old, educated in England, trained at Sandhurst, commissioned into the Cameronians before returning to Oman, overthrew him in a palace coup conducted with British advice and assistance. The former Sultan was flown to an RAF hospital in Wiltshire, where he asked to stay and was found a house. The British files on the specific SAS role in the coup remain largely censored. What the National Archives do show is a Defence Intelligence Staff memo dated 8 July 1970, noting that the coup was expected within days and stating that, in the Foreign Office's assessment, a change of ruler would be, on the whole, less disadvantageous to British interests than the existing situation. A subsequent document, dated the 16th of July 1970 and marked Secret UK Eyes Only, outlines British contingency planning in the event the coup failed and Qaboos needed to be extracted, noting that British officers attached to the Sultan's armed forces had been given instructions for this eventuality without the knowledge of the British military secretary to the old Sultan. The coup went ahead on July 23rd. Qaboos took power. He requested British military help immediately. The SAS arrived in Oman, operating officially as the British Army Training Team, the BATT. No uniforms, no public acknowledgement of their role. The operation was approved at government level. Edward Heath's Conservative administration, in office from June 1970, authorised the deployment. Prior Labour governments, under Harold Wilson, had already committed British military advisers. The public was told nothing. The designation British Army Training Team was the fiction that made this legally and politically survivable. Advisers, not combatants. Roger Cole, one of the 9 men in the Batt House at Mirbat, later described the operational framework plainly. As this was a secret operation, they had no rank as such. That was the architecture. 9 men with no official identity, in a country where they officially weren't, fighting a war that officially wasn't happening. The architect of what the British were actually doing in Dhofar was Lieutenant Colonel John Watts, B Squadron 22 SAS commander, who made a covert assessment of the situation on the ground and came back to Hereford describing what he'd found as horrifying. His own assessment, recorded in a PhD interview conducted in 1980, there were no Dhofaris in the Sultan's armed forces, which was virtually an army of occupation. Everybody on the Jebel was with the enemy, some convinced, some out of boredom, some intimidated. It was crazy. We were on a hiding-to-nothing fighting a people. Watts proposed a 5-point plan: an intelligence cell, an information team, a medical officer supported by SAS-trained medics, a veterinary officer for the livestock on which mountain communities depended, and, most consequentially, the recruitment of fearcats. Fearcats were paid Dhofari irregular units formed from defected Adu fighters. A communist guerrilla who returned to the government side wasn't imprisoned or shot. He was paid, armed, and sent back into the mountains he knew, fighting alongside the Sultan's forces against the men he had formerly served with. The principle was borrowed from the Malayan emergency. You don't win a counter-insurgency by killing your way through a mountain range. You win it by peeling the population away from the insurgents, removing their support base, and giving people a reason to be on the other side. The British footprint was deliberately small. Medical care, clean water wells, veterinary treatment, civil projects, all of this came first, and the military operations built on it. In October 1971, Operation Jaguar pushed this logic into its most demanding test: a forced occupation of the Jebel in eastern Dhofar, conducted by G Squadron SAS, 5 Firkat units, and a battalion of the Sultan's armed forces under Watts's command. The fighting was sustained and close range. The Adu attacked the SAS positions more than 40 times over 4 days. B Squadron was committed as reserve. By the summer of 1972, Jaguar had held the Leopard line of defensive positions across the Jebel was established. The firm base at Safed, occupied in April 1972 on Qaboos's orders, was cutting the Adu supply routes from Yemen, and defectors were crossing to the Firkats in increasing numbers. The PFLOAG leadership understood what was happening. They were losing ground, losing fighters to defection, losing the population. The British strategy was working, and it was working precisely because it was the opposite of what a conventional military occupation would do. A dramatic reversal was required, something that would demonstrate the government's vulnerability, shatter confidence in the Firkat programme, and expose the British presence in Oman for what it was. Mirbat was the target. A medium-sized coastal town 40 kilometres east of Salalah, accessible across the Jebel Ali approaches, lightly garrisoned, with a small fort and a handful of gendarmes. If the PFLOAG could take it, hold it, and declare it a seat of communist government in Dhofar, the political reversal would be immediate, and the British would face a stark choice. Either acknowledge their presence in Oman and deploy overtly, which would create a political crisis in London, or abandon the campaign entirely. The Adu assembled their best fighters for this assault. They timed it for the khareef, when the cloud would ground the Sultan's fast jets. They equipped it with mortars, rockets, recoilless rifles, and automatic weapons. What they had not fully accounted for was what was inside the Batt House, and particularly who was on the eastern side of the perimeter. 9 SAS men. Listed by name in the post-battle record, Captain Mike Kealy in command. Sergeant Talaiasi Labalaba, Laba. Trooper Sekonaya Takavesi, Tak. Sergeant Bob Bennett. Corporal Roger Cole. Corporal Jeff Taylor. Lance Corporal Pete Warne. Trooper Tommy Tobin. Trooper Austin Hussey. The Batt House itself wasn't much to look at. A single story of mud and stone sandbagged around its perimeter, with a rooftop firing position and a Browning M2 heavy machine gun on a mount. Below, at ground level, 2 81mm mortar tubes set in sandbagged revetments. Inside, the signals equipment that connected this position to al-Khareef at Salalah. A building that had been designed to shelter a training team, repurposed into something closer to a fighting position by the men who understood the ground. The 9 of them had been in Mirbat for close to a year. That tour was nearly finished. The men who would relieve them, G Squadron, were already at Salalah. Those last days under the khareef had their own particular texture. The monsoon cloud hangs so low over the Dhofar coast that the plateau above Mirbat simply disappears. In July, the temperature is suppressed by the cloud cover to something tolerable, unlike the savage heat of the dry season. But the humidity is absolute. Everything is damp. Visibility is intermittent, and the landscape reduces to a monochrome of grey and ochre through the mist. At night, the perimeter wire and the distant outline of the Wali's fort are the boundaries of what you can see. Beyond that, the Wadi system to the north gives way to the Jebel slopes, and in 3 weeks of khareef, those slopes had been the quiet background to a garrison that had seen nothing more than the usual low-level friction of the campaign. The men sleeping in the Batt House on the night of the 18th into the 19th had no specific forewarning of what was coming. Intelligence analysis had identified increased Adu activity in the weeks before, but the khareef was always a period of Adu movement. The cloud cover that grounded the Sultan's air assets was equally convenient for resupply and repositioning. None of the post-battle accounts record any particular tension on the night before. It was a July night under the monsoon cloud, quiet, damp, and close to the end of a long tour. Of the 9, Labalaba's record was the most documented prior to Mirbat. His British Empire Medal citation, gazetted in the London Gazette in May 1968, covers the period September 1965 to October 1967. Operations in Borneo, where the citation notes he played a leading part in a most successful SAS ambush, personally killing or wounding a number of Indonesians by his calmness and accurate fire. And then in Aden, where he operated either alone or in a very small group on a particular long-term hazardous esoteric operation, mingling with local populations under constant threat of exposure, and on one occasion commanding a small covert patrol that killed 3 and wounded 2 attackers when compromised. The citation closes with the phrase that he had been an inspiration to his Fijian countrymen and land of his birth, but an inspiration to his fellow British comrades. He had returned to the Royal Irish Rangers after the Borneo and Aden deployments. The BEM was formally gazetted while he held a sergeant's rank in that regiment, before rejoining B Squadron for Oman. He was born on July 13, 1942. He died on July 19, 1972. He was 30 years old and 6 days. Talaiasi had enlisted in the British Army in November 1961 with the King's Own Border Regiment, passed SAS selection and served with B Squadron. In Aden, he and Labalaba had at one point together shot dead 2 terrorist gunmen in a close-quarters confrontation. They were, in the language the regiment uses without inflation, experienced men. Talaiasi's comrades knew him as Tack, a great big teddy bear, according to Roger Cole's memoir, a man of enormous physical capability and entirely undemonstrative about it. Tobin was the team's medic. Kealy had command. The others occupied the positions a 9-man Batt team routinely held at a defended location. Signals, weapons, the sandbagged roof of the Batt House with its Browning M2 heavy machine gun and 2 mortar tubes at ground level. The town of Mirbat itself wasn't large. The Batt House stood approximately 200 yards north of the main settlement, oriented towards the approaches. Several hundred yards to the east, nearer the coast, stood the Wally's Fort, a small stone structure manned by approximately 25 gendarmes of the Dhofar gendarmerie, armed primarily with .303 bolt-action rifles, weapons that had been old in the Second World War and were significantly outgunned by what the Adu carried. Adjacent to the fort, in a sandbagged emplacement designated the No. 10 gun pit, sat the one piece of heavy artillery available to the garrison, a QF 25-pounder field gun, a Second World War artillery piece weighing nearly 2 tons in its fighting configuration, firing an 87.6mm projectile at a designed maximum range of approximately 13,400 yards. The 25-pounder's standard crew requirement was 6 men, a commander, a breech operator, a layer, a loader, and 2 ammunition handlers. It fired separate ammunition, projectile loaded first, then a cartridge case containing bags of propellant. Operating it accurately at designed range required a trained crew working in coordination, calling corrections, adjusting charges, working the breech under range discipline. Operating it alone at any range was a practical impossibility. Operating it at direct fire range, barrel lowered to 0 trajectory, aimed by looking straight down the bore at targets a few hundred meters away, was something the weapon had not been designed for at all, though it was capable of it. The mention in Dispatch's citation records, dryly, that neither Labalaba nor Talaiasi had received any previous artillery training other than a 2-day course on the mechanics of handling this particular gun. 2 days on the mechanics. They knew how to load it and how to fire it. The distance from the Batt House to the gun pit was approximately 500 yards of flat, open ground with no cover. Also in position that night, in the wadi system to the north, were the Adu. They had moved throughout the night. Their webbing was cloth-wrapped to muffle sound. The forward picket at Jebel Ali, 2 or 3 gendarmes on an exposed hillside a kilometre north of the town, was the first thing they killed. One of the gendarmes managed to fire a warning shot before his throat was cut. At 05:30 hours on the morning of July 19, 1972, mortars began falling on the Mirbat garrison. The first rounds came from multiple positions simultaneously. The Adu had pre-registered the Batt House, the Wali's fort, and the gun pit separately. The opening barrage wasn't exploratory, it was aimed. Recoilless rifle fire followed within seconds, targeting the stone walls of the fort. RPG rounds came in from the flanks. The Adu assault formation had rehearsed this opening sequence. Each element knew its objective. Kealy was on the roof of the Batt House within moments of the first detonation. Through the pre-dawn light and khareef mist, he could make out figures advancing from the direction of Jebel Ali. A line of men materializing out of the grey, moving in waves across the broken ground north of the wire. His initial assessment was that it was the night picket returning from duty. The khareef cloud, dense and low, ruled out fast jets from Salalah. The radio confirmed this within minutes. The Sultan of Oman's air force was effectively grounded, at least the jet element. The Browning and the mortar were buying time, but the Adu force was large enough to absorb fire from a single defensive position and keep advancing. The gendarmes in the Wali's fort were pinned and falling back. The forward perimeter posts had been overrun in the opening minutes without a single organized defensive response. The gun pit was 800 meters from the eastern edge of the Adu assault. At that range, the 25-pounder was the only weapon in the garrison capable of putting high explosive into the attacking formation in the quantities needed to slow it. Without the 25-pounder, the Adu would reach the wire intact. With it, properly served, each round detonating in a dense assault formation was a different calculation entirely. Laba left the Batt House. He ran. 500 yards of open ground between the Batt House and the gun pit, with no cover, no defilade, nothing between him and the Adu fire except speed and the low visibility of the khareef mist. Mortar rounds were falling. RPG backblast lit the ground behind the advancing Adu formation. Small arms fire from the wadi system to the north was already reaching the flat ground between the buildings. The Browning on the Batt House roof was firing to cover him, and the Adu immediately redirected a portion of their fire onto the gun pit emplacement, recognizing what was about to happen. He reached the gun pit at a run and dived in. The Omani artilleryman who had been assigned to the gun had been wounded early in the opening barrage. Labalaba found the gun unserved and the position under direct fire. He brought the weapon into action alone. What the mid-citation records, this is the actual citation language, not a summary of it, is that under heavy and accurate mortar fire, Labalaba reached the gun pit and, quickly and effectively, brought it into action. He began firing. The 25-pounder's designed role was indirect fire at ranges measured in thousands of yards, the projectile arcing high and dropping onto targets the crew couldn't see. Labalaba had no forward observer, no radio link to a fire direction center, and the targets were in direct line of sight at distances that made the gun's trajectory sights useless. He lowered the barrel. He sighted down the bore. He fired a high-explosive round directly into the teeth of the advancing formation and reloaded. approximately 1 round per minute. One man operating a 6-man weapon, managing the breech, ramming the projectile, loading the propellant bag, firing, clearing the hot brass, beginning again, while mortar rounds fell around the gun pit and the Adu concentrated everything they had on silencing him. The PFLOAG command identified the 25-pounder as a priority target within minutes. Subsequent debriefing of captured Adu personnel confirmed this. They had, in the opening phase, directed an effective and accurate fire on the crew with all their available weapons. They had also brought their own trained artillery crews specifically to operate the gun once they took it. Their plan required taking the 25-pounder intact. Labalaba was directly in the way of the plan, and the plan wasn't succeeding. A radio message reached the Batt House from the gun pit. A bullet had struck Labalaba in the chin. He reported this, indicated he was badly injured and struggling to operate the gun alone, and kept firing. Kealy asked for a volunteer. Talaiasi answered without hesitation. The Batt House team provided covering fire, the Browning traversing to lay fire between Tak and the advancing Adu line, as he covered the 500 yards under tracer fire and exploding mortar rounds, dived headlong into the gun pit and found Labalaba still working the weapon. Face wound and all, blood on the gun and on his hands, Labalaba gave no indication of how badly he was hurt, indicated only that he needed help, and kept firing. Talaiasi began loading. Together, the 2 Fijians continued to serve the 25-pounder. Talaiasi also ran to the Wali's fort door and called for assistance. An Omani artilleryman, Walid Khamis, came out and ran to the gun pit with him. As they cleared the sandbags, Khamis was hit in the stomach. He was treated and remained in the fight, but the burden of operating the gun fell on the 2 Fijians. The assault was entering its most dangerous phase, each reload requiring Labalaba to manage the breech and propellant under a chin wound that was bleeding freely, while Talaiasi fired his SLR between gun rounds to keep individual Adu from rushing the sandbag walls. The mid-citation is explicit about the weight of fire they were receiving. The enemy concentrated a major effort against the SAS personnel in the town and closed to grenade range and fought with a ferocity, tenacity and blind dedication that is the mark of all communist shock troops. Eventually, when Talaiasi's own wounds became severe enough to limit his ability to handle the heavy ammunition, the citation records that Labalaba continued to control and fire the gun when Talaiasi was unable to assist in the heavy work of handling the ammunition due to the severity of his wounds. One man, wounded in the face, alone with a 6-man weapon at point-blank range against an infantry assault in the last stages of overrunning his position. This is the documented fact. They covered the open ground under direct fire, rounds striking the dirt around them, and dived in. The picture Kealy found when he cleared the sandbag wall was this: Labalaba, face down, very still. Talaiasi propped against the sandbags, SLR across his knees, shot through the shoulder and grazed across the back of the head, continuing to engage the approaching Adu despite both wounds. Walid Khamis alive but critically wounded from the stomach shot, Tobin going to him immediately. Kealy took the adjacent sandbagged ammunition bay and covered the right side of the emplacement. An Adu fighter appeared at the side of the gun pit. Kealy shot him at close range. Hand grenades came in from the attackers, several of them arcing over the sandbag walls. Only one detonated, exploding behind the emplacement with no casualties from the blast itself. The Adu were now close enough to lob grenades by hand, which meant they were within 15 to 20 meters of the position. Britain's Small Wars records that two of the newest G Squadron members thought they were on their way to the firing range until the bullets started. They were in 3 helicopters and airborne before they had time to reconsider. They landed south of Mirbat and assaulted immediately into the Adu's southern flank, the direction the PFLOAG had left lightly covered, expecting their escape route to remain clear. It didn't remain clear. The strike masters were still running passes over the Wadi to the north. The flanking assault and the air support converged on the same Adu formation from 2 directions at once, and the calculation that the PFLOAG had made at the start of the morning, that a large enough force would overwhelm a small enough garrison, no longer held. The PFLOAG withdrew. By approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, the Adu were in retreat. Subsequent intelligence reporting raised the estimate to 100 or more. The number who attacked is equally contested. The British assessment gives approximately 250. PFLOAG's own subsequent accounts, collected by historians in the 1990s, suggest a committed force closer to 400. Pick any pairing from those ranges and the asymmetry is clear enough. The official British communiqué, released shortly after the battle, characterised it as a minor incident. The Sultan's government made no public statement. The British press received nothing. The names of the men who had fought that morning weren't released for years. The gallantry awards arising from Mirbat were announced 3 years after the event. Captain Kealy received the Distinguished Service Order. Trooper Takavesi received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Sergeant Bennett received the Military Medal. Sergeant Labalaba received a posthumous mention in dispatches. The mention in dispatches is the lowest tier of formal bravery recognition. At the time, it and the Victoria Cross were the only decorations that could be awarded posthumously. The MID therefore represented, for a man killed in action in a secret war, the minimum that the system permitted. The text of the MID citation, when it was eventually published in the London Gazette, left no ambiguity about what Labalaba had done. The citation records the full sequence of the gun pit action: the run under fire, the wound, the continued operation of a 6-man weapon alone, the refusal to stop. It ends with this language: "There can be no doubt that the leadership and determination displayed by Labalaba was an inspiration to every man in the garrison. Equally, it provided a bulwark which the enemy found impossible to breach. Had the enemy taken the 25-pounder, there is no doubt that they would have captured the city by directing it onto all the substantial defensive positions." To a large extent, Labalaba's leadership, his incredible bravery and his determination in the face of overwhelming odds have contributed disproportionately to the defeat of the enemy and to the retention of the city of Mirbat in government hands. A mention in dispatches for that. The structural reason isn't difficult to identify, even if it's difficult to accept. The Victoria Cross application requires a formal submission, parliamentary visibility, a public citation, a ceremony. Multiple times. The regiment's veterans have never accepted this reasoning as adequate. In October 2018, Prince Harry dedicated a bronze statue of Labalaba at Nadi International Airport in Fiji, near the village where he was born. A second statue stands at SAS headquarters in Hereford. These aren't the Victoria Cross. They are a recognition without legal force, awarded by those who served alongside him rather than by the institution that sent him. Mike Kealy, who commanded the garrison and ran the 500 yards to the gun pit under fire and held it until G Squadron arrived. Kealy died in February 1979 of exposure during an SAS endurance exercise on the Brecon Beacons. He was found by John Watts, by then a lieutenant general, who had set the entire Dhofar campaign in motion. Watts found the body of the man who had commanded its most extreme moment on a Welsh hillside 7 years later. The PFLOAG didn't recover its operational confidence after Mirbat. This assessment appears consistently across the subsequent military history of the campaign. From John Akehurst's 1982 account, Akehurst served as a British brigadier seconded to the Sultan of Oman and commanded the later phases of the campaign, to the academic literature that followed. The assault had been planned as the decisive blow, a dramatic reversal that would shatter confidence in the British strategy and demonstrate that the Sultan's government couldn't protect its own territory. Instead, the PFLOAG's own confidence was what broke. A force of between 250 and 400 fighters, with mortars and rockets and recoilless rifles and trained artillery crews embedded in their assault formation, had failed to take a coastal town held by 9 men, had failed to take the gun that was supposed to be turned on the garrison, and had left between 40 and 100 of their number dead on the field. The strategic demonstration had gone the wrong way. The firqats continued to grow. Dhofari men who had been uncertain about which side to join now had a clear data point. The Jebel continued to be retaken methodically. British and Omani forces advancing in the dry season, holding through each successive khareef, pushing the leopard line westward. The firm base at Sarfeh continued to strangle the PFLOAG supply routes from Yemen. Iranian forces joined the campaign in 1973 under bilateral agreement with Qaboos. Adding conventional military weight, the Sultan's armed forces alone couldn't provide. The PFLOAG's external patrons, the Soviet Union through South Yemen, China, continued to supply weapons, but the supply couldn't compensate for the loss of population support on the Jebel itself, which was what the Watts Plan had been steadily eroding since 1970. By the end of 1975, the Sultan's forces had retaken the entire Dhofar plateau. The war was declared over in 1976. The SAS lost 12 men across the full 6-year campaign. 12. In a declared non-war against a Soviet and Chinese-backed insurgency that had controlled most of the province when it started. The wider British military total across all services varied by source and remains difficult to pin to a single confirmed figure. The 12 SAS dead give the scale of a campaign whose British cost was, for its strategic outcome, extraordinarily small. Extraordinarily small and entirely unacknowledged for years. The British government eventually acknowledged the campaign's existence, but that acknowledgement arrived in careful, incremental steps that preserved the essential fiction well into the campaign's aftermath. The Dhofar War was never formally declared a war. The SAS personnel were, legally and officially, a training mission throughout. The consequences of that designation extended directly to the man in the gun pit. Laba died in a war that wasn't a war. The recognition reflects that designation, and the mention in dispatches hasn't been upgraded. What Mirbat proved, operationally, not rhetorically, is that a small, technically proficient, linguistically capable British military presence embedded in a population-focused counterinsurgency strategy could defeat a numerically superior, externally supported, ideologically committed enemy force, provided 2 conditions were met. First, that the strategy itself was sound, and second, that the individuals holding the hardest positions had the professional discipline and the personal courage to hold them past the point at which any rational calculation would have suggested otherwise. Both conditions were met on July 19, 1972. The strategy was Watts's. The discipline and courage were 9 men's, and most acutely, for the better part of that morning, one man's. If you're here because you want more stories told in this register, the actual record, in the actual detail, without the inflation, subscribe.